Tom Hanchett. I'm a community historian here in Charlotte. Worked for about 16 years with Levine Museum of the New South, and I'm now retired, and I get to go to festivals. You know, when you're talking about Juneteenth, you're talking about the real ending of the Civil War for enslaved people in Texas specifically. There was been the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Of course, the war started in 1861, and 1863, Abraham Lincoln says enslaved people in the Confederate States, not the Union States where there was slavery, but in the Confederate States are hereby free. He was hoping to bring those people into the fighting, and that indeed happened. But when the war officially ended in April of 1865, you could not check Facebook, you could not turn on CNN. Word of mouth was what carried the news everywhere. And in Texas, it's a long way away from Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, but also the ability of people to move through space, that was what was constrained in slavery times. And so put it bluntly, the white folks didn't get around to telling the enslaved folks that they were free until the word filtered down on June 19th of 1865.
My name is Pap Seydunjai, and I'm the owner of House of Africa and president of the Juneteenth Festival of the Carolinas. Juneteenth started in Galveston, Texas, because the slaves in Galveston, Texas, they did not know they were free until 2.5 years later after the proclamation. And when they found out, that was on June the 19th, 1865, that's when they start celebrating Juneteenth.
Juneteenth, as we all know, is freedom, the abolishment of slavery. So just being able to be in this world, to see from where we have digressed, is truly a pleasure. To me, Juneteenth celebrates nationalities, your culture, as we know that the slaves celebrated with dancing and singing and food and just involvement, just having a good time. If you can relate back in slavery time, one of their joys or enjoyments was sitting around singing old songs, things that made them happy. So with me and Juneteenth, it is just learning about or educating people about Juneteenth, because there are so many African Americans that still don't know the meaning of Juneteenth and what it involves. And it's really, really sad because no one has highlighted till just recently. It's always been in existence, but it has not been a situation where people talk about it.
So my name is Adam Biggs, and I teach African American Studies and History at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. I think in some ways it was more well known in an area like Texas and Louisiana, in that kind of region, than it was in other areas. When I try to think about when I first learned about Juneteenth, I want to say I was in high school. But it might have been a little bit after that even. It might have been as an undergrad in some way. But there were Juneteenth celebrations in Chicago. So it had to be when I was in high school, I want to say, at some point. But I think for some folks, I want to say there's sort of a trepidation, or there has been a trepidation over whether or not Juneteenth was something that should be celebrated, I'd say. Because some people look at Juneteenth, and I know the joke about Juneteenth was, well, nobody told us, right? The idea was that, here, freedom had sort of hit the land, so to speak. Slavery had ended, I should say. But nobody had told us, in Galveston, Texas, right? And so some people do look at it as less as a sort of celebratory moment and more as sort of more of a humiliating kind of moment, I think, for some people.
The Emancipation Proclamation, I think Lincoln had several ideas in mind when he issued that. One was to affirm that the war was about ending slavery. And there's still a debate, was it about states' rights? Was it about ending slavery? Many different views back then. And to get folks to coalesce, folks on the Union side, to coalesce around this view that all people are created equal. That was part of, I think, what Abraham Lincoln wanted. But also, he needed something to demoralize the white Confederate leadership. And even though he had no official control over the Confederacy, as long as they were at war, they said he didn't, issuing this Emancipation Proclamation was a way of saying, hey, y'all, I am your president, even if you don't acknowledge it. And I hereby, with whatever power I have, I set free these people. And it was a message to the enslaved people that, be part of this if you can, if you wish. And that notion of demoralizing the white Confederate leadership and empowering the black people of the South, that was the aim of the Emancipation Proclamation.
So you have large numbers of slave communities who, when they realize that things like the Emancipation Proclamation come into being, they start leaving southern plantations. When they hear that Union forces are coming through the area, right? When they hear that they're nearby, they start abandoning their plantations and going to attach themselves or going to bond or to join those Union forces, right? But as the emancipation, when talk of the Emancipation Proclamation is being had, there are also concerns within the Union forces and within northern communities about whether or not this is actually, if this is a war about preserving the Union, there are a lot of white communities in the North who say, well, if this is a war about freeing black people and promoting racial equality, we're not in it for that.
Now, it wasn't covering the whole United States. And this is something a lot of folks are surprised at, but northern states, not all of them, but some of the northern states had slavery. And the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to them because Lincoln didn't want to push too hard. And so, the Emancipation Proclamation was symbolically very important, but it didn't really set anybody free. That came with the end of the Civil War.
With Juneteenth is that sometimes people think about the end of slavery being, with the Emancipation Proclamation. Sometimes people think about it being Juneteenth. And then sometimes people think about it being with the 13th Amendment, the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865, right? And each of these sort of represents a different step in this process, right? When we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, that was issued as a military tool, right? That I talked a little bit about before, but it only applied to states that were in rebellion, right? So when it's issued in 1863, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri are all states that hold slaves, but that don't fall under the jurisdiction of the Emancipation Proclamation.
What started the Civil War? People debate whether it was slavery, ending slavery, kind of a moral crusade. There were certainly folks who very much believed it. People who called themselves abolitionists were often morally against slavery. There were folks who were also economically against slavery. And this is a kind of a new interpretation, not that new, maybe 20, 30 years. Up north, the main way that labor happened was that the new factory owners paid people to work in the factories. And same thing with farmers. Either you owned your own land or somebody paid you to do that. But as this new factory economy is springing up in the North, South isn't doing that because they're into plantation slavery. But the North is developing this new wage labor economy, and there's the South competing with them. And don't like that. And so you get this kind of strange anomaly where there are people who fight on the Union side who are not particularly morally against slavery. They're just against the economic competition that this slave system, meets them with. In the North, the Union effort to fight against this self-declared Confederacy was in danger of coming apart. In the South, I grew up in Virginia and heard that it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. Well, you start asking, what was the states' rights they were talking about? It wasn't the right to get married or own a piece of land or something like. It was the right to own another human being, and that was the right that was at stake.
When I think about Juneteenth, it's a sort of a joyous and an ironic sort of celebration, right? Because I think one of the ways we can think about it, it is like a significant marker of the end of slavery in some respects, right? It's a significant moment in sort of the abolition of the institution of slavery. But it's also ironic because, like for so many things for African Americans and people of color, if at all, it comes belatedly, right? The war itself has been over for, I think, 2 months already at that point, or at least Lee has surrendered. And it's, in many ways, it's joyous because of what it represents, but it also, it is not sort of the achievement of a promised land. It's not as though, like I said, black people get free and then all of a sudden they reach, the other side of the River Jordan, right? They find themselves, they're able to reconnect with families, which is huge. And we see, really some heartfelt and compelling stories about loved ones and children and parents who take enormous efforts to reconnect with family members who they think are dead and gone, right? Who had been sold off years before or who were separated during the course of the war. And they really are taking tremendous efforts to reconnect with these lost family members. And it's amazing, I think, how effective their efforts to reconnect with people are, right? Their memories are just tremendous. And with the help of a number of northern missionary teachers who come down from areas like New England they take part in what becomes like a letter writing campaign to communicate, in ways that we probably would not think of as being possible in, 1865.
So Juneteenth, I think, was very little known here in the Southeast until the 1970s, when the notion of African American history and say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud, that kind of whole thing erupts out of the 60s and into the 1970s. And here in Charlotte, there was a Council for Equal Rights that was put together in mid-late 70s, community organizing, empowerment kind of thing. And they, as far as we can tell, organized the first Juneteenth in Charlotte. And that was in 1978. And a couple of women who led that, one Carrie Graves, who was very much interested in tenant rights, public housing rights, and then Thelma McCoy, both of whom are still around, helped make that happen for a number of years. And I think it kind of, it's hard to do something year after year. In the 90s, Pap Ndiaye from Senegal showed up here in Charlotte and opened the House of Africa in Plaza Midwood. Plaza Midwood was down on its heels. Rent was cheap, and he found a space on Thomas Avenue and filled it with art from his travels all around Africa.
He started here in front of House of Africa with 1,000 people. And after 7 years, it got so big that we have to move it to Independence Park on 7th Street. And after 10 years there, we brought it back where it started 24 years ago.
History is how we got here. And we is not just one group, it's all groups. And that's something that in my lifetime I've watched expand, is this notion that History does not just belong to well-to-do white Americans. Black history does not just belong to African Americans. It is something that we need to share together. We of course have ownership of our own history, but this notion that, the celebrations can draw different kinds of people into the same space, enjoying the same thing, I think gives us a commonality that is so important in creating a true community. Charlotte is a city of newcomers. Most of us were born around here. And these community building events are ways to invest ourselves in this place and to find other people of like spirit who we consider to be our brothers and sisters.
Starting with Juneteenth for Faith Open Victory Christian Church, and Anthony Pelham is my pastor. The area that we wanted to stand on was education. And I'm with Connie. We perish for the lack of knowledge. So we really want to educate the Red Rose City. And I want to see Juneteenth as diverse as the 4th of July. There should be many nationalities out here. I don't want people to think this is just an African American event. We all sitting here celebrate the 4th of July. But truth be told, in 1776, our ancestors were not free. And it's not that we didn't come into that freedom. The last slaves didn't come into that freedom until the 1865 era. So what better way to try to unite than to unite on the last persons in America being freed that we should be celebrating as a nation?
We cannot wait for them to show us our history. History is something that we make as people. History is something that we need to learn as people.